The second 80-20 wave, the information revolution. The information revolution that began in the 1960s has already transformed work habits and the efficiency of large tracts of business. It is just beginning to do more than this, to help change the nature of the organizations that are today's dominant force in society. The 80-20 principle was, is, and will be a key accessory of the information revolution, helping to direct its force intelligently. Perhaps because they were close to the quality movement, the computing and software professionals behind the information revolution were generally familiar with the 80-20 principle and used it extensively. To judge by the number of computing and software articles that refer to the 80-20 principle, most hardware and software developers understand and use it in their daily work. The information revolution has been most effective when using the 80-20 principle's concepts of selectivity and simplicity. As two separate project directors testify, think small, don't plan to the nth degree on the first day. The return on investment usually follows the 80-20 rule. 80% of the benefits will be found in the simplest 20% of the system, and the final 20% of the benefits will come from the most complex 80% of the system. Apple used the 80-20 principle in developing the Apple Newton Message Pad, an electronic personal organizer. The Newton engineers took advantage of a slightly modified version of 80-20. They found that 0.01% of a person's vocabulary was sufficient to do 50% of the things you want to do with a small handheld computer. Increasingly, software is substituting for hardware, using the 80-20 principle. An example is the RISC software invented in 1994. RISC is based on a variation of the 80-20 rule. This rule assumes that most software spends 80% of its time executing only 20% of the available instructions. RISC processors optimize the performance of that 20% and keep chip size and cost down by eliminating the other 80%. RISC does in software what CISC, the previously dominant system, does in silicon. Those who apply software know that, even though it is incredibly efficient, usage follows 80-20 patterns. As one developer states, "The business world has long abided by the 80-20 rule. It's especially true for software, where 80% of a product's uses take advantage of only 20% of its capabilities. That means that most of us pay for what we don't want or need." Software developers finally seem to understand this, and many are betting that modular applications will solve the problem. Design of software is crucial, so that the most used functions are the easiest to use. The same approach has been used for new database services. How do software developers do it? First, they identify what customers want most of the time and how they want to do it. The old 80-20 rule. People use 20% of a program's functions 80% of the time. Good software developers make high-use functions as simple and automatic and inevitable as possible. Translating such an approach to today's database services would mean looking at key customer use all the time. How many times do customers call search service support desks to ask which file to pick or where a file can be found? Good design could eliminate such calls. Wherever one turns, effective innovations in information, in data storage, retrieval, and processing focus heavily on the up to 20% of key needs. The information revolution has a long way to run. The information revolution is the most subversive force business has ever known. Already the phenomenon of information power to the people has given knowledge and authority to frontline workers and technicians, destroying the power and often the jobs of middle management who were previously protected by proprietary knowledge. The information revolution has also decentralized corporations physically. The phone, the PC, broadband, and the increasing miniaturization and mobility of these technologies have already begun to destroy the power of corporate palaces and those who sit or used to sit in them. Ultimately, the information revolution will help to destroy the profession of management itself, thus enabling much greater direct value creation by doers in corporations for their key customers. The value of automated information is increasing exponentially, much faster than we can use it. The key to using this power effectively, now and in the future, lies in selectivity, in applying the 80-20 principle. Peter Drucker points the way. A database, no matter how copious, is not information. It is information's ore. The information a business most depends on is available, if at all, only in a primitive and disorganized form. For what a business needs the most for its decisions, especially its strategic ones, are data about what goes on outside of it. It is only outside the business where there are results, opportunities, and threats. Drucker argues that we need new ways of measuring wealth creation. Ian Godden and I call these new tools automated performance measures. They are just beginning to be created by some corporations. But well over 80%, probably around 99%, of the information revolution's resources are still being applied to counting better what we used to count, paving over the cowpats, rather than creating and simplifying measures of genuine corporate wealth creation. The tiny proportion of effort that uses the information revolution to create a different sort of corporation will have an explosive impact. The 80-20 principle is still the best-kept business secret. Considering the importance of the 80-20 principle and the extent to which it is known by managers, it remains extremely discreet. Even the 80-20 term itself caught on very slowly and without any visible landmarks. Given the piecemeal use and gradual spread of the 80-20 principle, it remains underexploited, even by those who recognize the idea. It is extremely versatile. It can be profitably applied to any industry and any organization, any function within an organization, and any individual job. The 80-20 principle can help the chief executive, line managers, functional specialists, and any knowledge worker down to the lowest level or the newest trainee. And although its uses are manifold, there is an underlying, unifying logic that explains why the 80-20 principle works and is so valuable. Why the 80-20 principle works in business. The 80-20 principle applied to business has one key theme: to generate the most money with the least expenditure of assets and effort. The classical economists of the 19th and early 20th centuries developed a theory of economic equilibrium and of the firm that has dominated thinking ever since. The theory states that under perfect competition, firms do not make excess returns, and profitability is either zero or the normal cost of capital, the latter usually being defined by a modest interest charge. The theory is internally consistent and has the sole flaw that it cannot be applied to real economic activity of any kind, and especially not to the operations of any individual firm. The 80-20 theory of the firm. In contrast to the theory of perfect competition, the 80-20 theory of the firm is both verifiable, and has in fact been verified many times, and helpful as a guide to action. The 80-20 theory of the firm goes like this. In any market, some suppliers will be much better than others at satisfying customer needs. These suppliers will obtain the highest price realizations and also the highest market shares. In any market, some suppliers will be much better than others at minimizing expenditure relative to revenues. In other words, these suppliers' products will cost less than other suppliers for equivalent output and revenue, Or alternatively, they will be able to generate equivalent output with lower expenditure. Some suppliers will generate much higher surpluses than others. I use the phrase surpluses rather than profits because the latter normally implies the profit available for shareholders. The concept of surplus implies the level of funds available for profits or reinvestment over and above what is needed normally to keep the wheels turning. Higher surpluses will result in one or more of the following. 1. Greater reinvestment in product and service to produce greater superiority and appeal to customers. 2. Investment in gaining market share through greater sales and marketing effort and/or takeovers of other firms. 3. Higher returns to employees, which will tend to have the effect of retaining and attracting the best people in the market. And/or 4. Higher returns to shareholders, which will tend to raise share prices and lower the cost of capital, facilitating investment and/or takeovers. Over time, 80% of the market will tend to be supplied by 20% or fewer of the suppliers, who will normally also be more profitable. At this point, it is possible that the market structure may reach an equilibrium, although it will be a very different kind of equilibrium from that beloved of the economist's perfect competition model. In the 80-20 equilibrium, a few suppliers, the largest, will offer customers better value for money and have higher profits than smaller rivals. This is frequently observed in real life, despite being impossible according to the theory of perfect competition. We may term our more realistic theory the 80-20 law of competition. But the real world does not generally rest long in a tranquil equilibrium. Sooner or later, usually sooner, there are always changes to market structure caused by competitors' innovations. Both existing suppliers and new suppliers will seek to innovate and obtain a high share of a small but defensible part of each market, a market segment. Segmentation of this kind is possible by providing a more specialized product or service ideally suited to particular types of customer. Over time, markets will tend to comprise more market segments. Within each of these segments, the 80-20 law of competition will operate. The leaders in each specialist segment may either be firms operating largely or exclusively in that segment or industry generalists, but their success will be dependent, in each segment, on obtaining the greatest revenue with the lowest expenditure of effort. In each segment, some firms will be much better than others at doing this and will tend to accumulate segment market share as a result. Any large firm will operate in a large number of segments, that is, in a large number of customer-product combinations where a different formula is required to maximize revenue relative to effort and/or where different competitors are met. In some of these segments, the individual large firm will generate large surpluses, and in other segments, much lower surpluses, or even deficits. It will tend to be true, therefore, that 80% of surpluses or profits are generated by 20% of segments, and by 20% of customers, and by 20% of products. The most profitable segments will tend to, but will not always, be where the firm enjoys the highest market shares, and where the firm has the most loyal customers, loyalty being defined by being long-standing and least likely to defect to competitors. Within any firm, as with all entities dependent on nature and human endeavour, there is likely to be an inequality between inputs and outputs, an imbalance between effort and reward. Externally, this is reflected in the fact that some markets, products and customers are much more profitable than others. Internally, the same principle is reflected by the fact that some resources, be they people, factories, machines or permutations of these, will produce very much more value relative to their cost than will other resources. If we were able to measure it, as we can with some jobs such as those of salespeople, we would find that some people generate a very large surplus, Their attributable share of revenue is very much greater than their full cost, whereas many people generate a small surplus or a deficit. Firms that generate the largest surpluses also tend to have the highest average surplus per employee. But in all firms, the true surplus generated by each employee tends to be very unequal. 80% of the surplus is usually generated by 20% of employees. At the lowest level of aggregation of resources within the firm, for example, an individual employee, 80% of the value created is likely to be generated in a small part, approximately 20%, of the time when, through a combination of circumstances, including personal characteristics and the exact nature of the task, the employee is operating at several times his or her normal level of effectiveness. The principles of unequal effort and return therefore operate at all levels of business: markets, market segments, products, customers, departments, and employees. It is this lack of balance, rather than a notional equilibrium, that characterizes all economic activity. Apparently small differences create large consequences. A product has only to be 10% better value than that of a competing product to generate a sales difference of 50% and a profit difference of 100%. 3 action implications. One implication of the 80-20 theory of firms is that successful firms operate in markets where it is possible for that firm to generate the highest revenues with the least effort. This will be true both absolutely, that is, relative to monetary profits, and relatively, that is, in relation to competition. A firm cannot be judged successful unless it has a high absolute surplus, in traditional terms, a high return on investment, and also a higher surplus than its competitors, higher margins. A second practical implication for all firms is that it is always possible to raise the economic surplus, usually by a large degree, by focusing only on those market and customer segments where the largest surpluses are currently being generated. This will always imply redeployment of resources into the most surplus-generating segments, and will normally also imply a reduction in the total level of resource and expenditure. In plain words, fewer employees and other costs. Firms rarely reach the highest level of surplus that they could attain, or anywhere near it, both because managers are often not aware of the potential for surplus, and because they often prefer to run large firms rather than exceptionally profitable ones. A third corollary is that it is possible for every corporation to raise the level of surplus by reducing the inequality of output and reward within the firm. This can be done by identifying the parts of the firm, people, factories, sales offices, overhead units, countries, that generate the highest surpluses, and reinforcing these, giving them more power and resources, and, conversely, identifying the resources generating low or negative surpluses, facilitating dramatic improvements and, if these are not forthcoming, stopping the expenditure on these resources. These principles constitute a useful 80-20 theory of the firm, but they must not be interpreted too rigidly or deterministically. The principles work because they are a reflection of relationships in nature, which are an intricate mixture of order and disorder, of regularity and irregularity. Look for irregular insights from the 80-20 principle. It is important to try to grasp the fluidity and force driving 80-20 relationships. Unless you appreciate this, you will interpret the 80-20 principle too rigidly and fail to exploit its full potential. The world is full of small causes that, when combined, can have momentous consequences. Think of a saucepan of milk that, when heated above a certain temperature, suddenly changes form, swelling up and bubbling over. One moment you have a nice, orderly pan of hot milk. The next moment you can either have a wonderful cappuccino or, If you are a second too late, a mess on top of your stove. Things take a little more time in business, but 1 year you can have an excellent and very profitable IBM dominating the computer industry, and before long, a combination of small causes resulting in a blinded monolith staggering to avoid destruction. Creative systems operate away from equilibrium. Cause and effect, input and output, operate in a non-linear way. You do not usually get back what you put in. You may sometimes get very much less and sometimes get very much more. Major alterations in a business system can flow from apparently insignificant causes. At any one time, people of equal intelligence, skill and dedication can produce quite unequal results as a result of small structural differences. Events cannot be predicted, although predictable patterns tend to recur. Identify lucky streaks. Control is therefore impossible, but it is possible to influence events and, perhaps even more important, it is possible to detect irregularities and benefit from them. The art of using the 80-20 principle is to identify which way the grain of reality is currently running and to exploit that as much as possible. Imagine you are in a crazy casino full of unbalanced roulette wheels. All numbers pay odds of 35 to 1, but individual numbers come up more or less frequently at different tables. At 1, number 5 comes up 1 time in 20. At another table, it only comes up 1 time in 50. If you back the right number at the right table, you can make a fortune. If you stubbornly keep backing number 5 at a table where it comes up 1 time in 50, your money will all disappear, regardless of how high your starting bank. If you can identify where your firm is getting back more than it is putting in, you can up the stakes and make a killing. Similarly, if you can work out where your firm is getting back much less than it is investing, you can cut your losses. In this context, the where can be anything. It can be a product, a market, a customer or type of customer, a technology, a channel of distribution, a department or division, a country, a type of transaction, or an employee, type of employee, or team. The game is to spot the few places where you are making great surpluses and to maximize them, and to identify the places where you are losing and get out. We have been trained to think in terms of cause and effect, of regular relationships, of average levels of return, of perfect competition, and of predictable outcomes. This is not the real world. The real world comprises a massive influences where cause and effect are blurred, and where complex feedback loops distort inputs, where equilibrium is fleeting and often illusory, where there are patterns of repeated but irregular performance, where firms never compete head-to-head and prosper by differentiation, and where a few favoured souls are able to corner the market for high returns. Viewed in this light, large firms are incredibly complex and constantly changing coalitions of forces, some of which are going with the grain of nature and making a fortune, while others are going against the grain and stacking up huge losses. All this is obscured by our inability to disentangle reality and by the calming, averaging, and highly distorting effects of accounting systems. The 80-20 principle is rampant but largely unobserved. What we are generally allowed to see in business is the net effect of what happens, which is by no means the whole picture. Beneath the surface there are warring positive and negative inputs that combine to produce the effect we can observe above the surface. The 80-20 principle is most useful when we can identify all the forces beneath the surface, so that we can stop the negative influences and give maximum power to the most productive forces. How companies can use the 80-20 principle to raise profits. Enough of history, philosophy, and theory. We now switch gears to the intensely practical. Any individual business can gain immensely through practical application of the 80-20 principle. It is time to show you how. Chapters 4 to 7 cover the most important ways to raise profits via the 80-20 principle. Chapter 8 closes Part 2 with hints on how to embed 80-20 thinking into your business life so that you can gain an unfair advantage over colleagues and competitors alike. We start in the next chapter with the most important use of the 80-20 principle in any firm, to isolate where you are really making the profits and, just as important, where you are really losing money. Every business person thinks they know this already, and nearly all are wrong. If they had the right picture, their whole business would be transformed. Chapter 4. Why your strategy is wrong. Unless you have used the 80-20 principle to redirect your strategy, you can be pretty sure that the strategy is badly flawed. Almost certainly you don't have an accurate picture of where you make and lose the most money. It is almost inevitable that you are doing too many things for too many people. Business strategy should not be a grand and sweeping overview. It should be more like an underview, a peek beneath the covers to look in great detail at what is going on. To arrive at a useful business strategy, you need to look carefully at the different chunks of your business, particularly at their profitability and cash generation. Unless your firm is very small and simple, it is almost certainly true that you make at least 80% of your profits and cash in 20% of your activity and in 20% of your revenues. The trick is to work out which 20%. Where are you making the most money? Identify which parts of the business are making very high returns, which are just about washing their faces, and which are disasters. To do this, we will conduct an 80-20 analysis of profits by different categories of business. By product or product group type. By customer or customer group type. By any other split that appears to be relevant for your business for which you have data, for example by geographical area or distribution channel. By competitive segment. Start with products. Your business will almost certainly have information by product or product group. For each, look at the sales over the last period, month, quarter or year, decide which is most reliable, and work out the profitability after allocating all costs. How easy or difficult this will be depends on the state of your management information. What you need may all be readily available, but if not, you'll have to build it up yourself. You are bound to have sales by product or product line, and almost certainly the gross margin, sales less cost of sales. You will also know the total costs for the whole business, or the overhead costs. What you then have to do is allocate all the overhead costs to each product group on some reasonable basis. The crudest way is to allocate cost on a percentage of turnover. A moment's thought, however, should convince you that this will not be very accurate. Some products take a great deal of salespeople's time relative to their value, for example, and others take very little. Some are heavily advertised and others not at all. Some require a lot of fussing around in manufacturing, whereas others are straightforward. Take each category of overhead cost and allocate it to each product group. Do this for all the costs, then look at the results. Typically, some products, representing a minority of turnover, are very profitable. Most products are modestly or marginally profitable, and some are making really large losses once you allocate all the costs. I recently conducted a study of an electronic instrumentation group, which had 8 groups of products that I labelled from A to H. Comparing the sales, income, and return on sales for each group with the company total, I could see that product group A accounted for only 3% of sales, but for 10% of profits. Product groups A, B and C accounted for 20% of sales, but for 53% of profits. When I compiled an 80-20 table and an 80-20 chart, this was very clear. We have not yet found the 20% of sales that account for 80% of profits, but we are on our way. If not 80-20, then 67-30. 30% of product sales account for almost 60% of profits. Already you may be thinking about what can be done to raise the sales of product groups A, B and C. For example, you might want to reallocate all sales effort from the other 80% of business, telling salespeople to concentrate on doubling the sales of products A, B and C and not to worry about the rest. If they succeeded in doing this, sales would only go up by 20%, but profits would rise more than 50%. You might also already be thinking about cutting costs or raising prices in product groups D, E and F, or about radical retrenchment or total exit from product groups G and H. What about customer profitability? After products, go on to look at customers. Repeat the analysis, but look at total purchases by each customer or customer group. Some customers pay high prices but have a high cost to serve. These are often smaller customers. The very big customers may be easy to deal with and take large volumes of the same product, but screw you down on price. Sometimes these differences balance out, but often they do not. For the electronic instrumentation group I studied, I broke the customers into 4 groups and labelled them types A to D. Type A customers are small, direct accounts paying very high prices and giving very fat gross margins. They are quite expensive to service, but the margins more than compensate for this. Type B customers are distributors who tend to place large orders and have very low costs to serve, yet for one reason or another find it acceptable to pay fairly high prices, mainly because the electronic components bought are a tiny fraction of their total product costs. Type C customers are export accounts paying high prices. The snag with them, however, is that they are very expensive to service. Type D customers are large manufacturers who bargain very hard on price and also demand a great deal of technical support and many specials. An 80-20 chart and table that compared each group's sales, income and return on sales with the company's total revealed a 59-15 rule and an 88-25 rule. The most profitable customer category accounted for 15% of revenues, but 59% of profits, and the most profitable 25% of customers yielded 88% of profits. This was partly because the most profitable customers tended to take the most profitable products, but also because they paid more in relation to their cost to service. The analysis led to a successful campaign to find more A and B customers, the small direct customers and the distributors. Even taking account of the cost of the campaign, the result was very profitable. Prices for C customers, the export accounts, were selectively raised and ways found to lower the cost of servicing some of them, particularly by greater use of telephone rather than face-to-face selling. The D customers, large manufacturers, were dealt with individually. 9 of these accounted for 97% of D sales. In some cases, technical development services were charged for separately. In others, prices were raised, and 3 accounts were tactically lost to the company's most hated competitor after a bidding war. The managers really wanted the competitor to enjoy these losses. 80-20 analysis applied to a consultancy firm. After products and customers, take any other split of business that appears especially relevant to your business. There was no special analysis in the case of the instrumentation company, but, for example, for a strategy consultant client of mine, a simple split of projects into large and small categories was very helpful. The figures showed a 56-21 rule. Large projects constituted only 21% of turnover, but gave 56% of profits. Another analysis split the business into old clients, more than 3 years old, new clients, less than 6 months old, and those in between. The figures showed that 26% of the business, old clients, made up 84% of the profits, an 84-26 rule. The message here was to strive above all to keep and expand long-serving clients who were the least price-sensitive and who could be served most cheaply. New clients who do not turn into long-serving clients were recognised as being loss-makers, leading to a much more selective approach to pitching for business. Pitches were only made where it was believed the company concerned would turn into a long-term client. This is the end of CD2. The book continues on CD3.